Chapter 473. Yvette stared at him in a daze. After a moment of silence, she said, "Even if I want to help you, I can't do anything. I'm a woman and I can't be a chieftain. Moreover, some of my brothers are very talented. I can't compete with them. There is nothing you can't do as long as you are willing to do it. Unless you are not willing to pay the price." Dean quietly looked at her. "It won't be difficult for you to be a tribal chief with my help. As for your brothers, they are a hindrance, so get rid of them." Yvette's face changed and she looked at him in anger. "You want me to kill my brother? If you want to be the king, aren't you willing to pay this price?" Dean looked at her eyes, and there seemed to be a sharp sword slowly stabbing out from the depths of his peaceful eyes. Yvette's face turned ugly. "What's the point of climbing to the throne with blood on my hands?" Dean indifferently smiled. "The so-called meaning is the harvest you get after completing a task. The tribal chief's rights, glory and the ability to lead your people into the Golden Wall. No matter how many years pass, you will be remembered by people. Aren't these enough to move you?" Yvette gritted her teeth. "I don't need to be remembered by people. I don't need the tribal chief's rights. I just want to live on the land we belong to. I don't want to be exiled barbarians. That's my dream. But what's the point of my dream if I kill my brothers and sisters for this? They are dead. Even if I can eventually lead my people to live inside the wall, but these people will lose their loved ones. Isn't this very ironic?" Dean's brows wrinkled. He didn't expect that this female savage valued family so much. He thought that her father, the savage chief, had dozens of children and his descendants would not be too united. They might even fight against each other for resources. However, it seemed to be the opposite. Did the harsh environment outside the wall make them cherish it more? "You will think so, but it doesn't mean that your brothers will think the same." Dean looked at her. "They will try their best to get rid of you if they know that you have a trump card to compete with them. Moreover, if you reject my conditions, how can I assist you? Without my help, your people won't be able to step into the wall in this life. Don't tell me that the future of your people is not as important as a few of your relatives?" "I need to think about it," Yvette said with a complicated look in her eyes. Dean stared at her for a moment. "Okay, I'll let Glenn send you back. I'll give you a week to think about it. I hope I'm satisfied with your answer. We'll meet at the 8th fortress under the Red Maple Mountains." Yvette breathed a sigh of relief and nodded. "I'll give you an answer." Dudian nodded and waved. "Go and pack your luggage." Yvette gave him a long look, got up and went upstairs. The sound of horses' hooves echoed from outside the castle as Yvette went up the stairs. Chapter 474. Dean said goodbye to everyone after Noyce put away the luggage. He took Noyce out from the back of the castle. Two figures quietly arrived outside a town in the middle reaches of the Tyza River. Dean stopped and rubbed his face with the help of the moonlight. He changed his face into an ordinary young man's face. Young master." Noyce was completely shocked as he saw Dean's magical change. Dean didn't hide it from him. "I didn't sneak out. I came to the outer wall to serve as an elder of the Dark Church. This mask is used to cover up my identity. It's called animal glue mask. It can change the face at will. It's too precious, so there's only one. From now on, when you follow me, you have to change your face and identity. Otherwise, if others know your identity, they will guess my identity." Noyce's eyes widened in shock. Dean looked at him but didn't speak. Noyce slowly digested the shocking news. "You want to take me to join the Dark Church?" "Yes, I know. You used to be a Knight of Light of the Holy Church. There will be a bit of resistance in your heart." Dean patted his shoulder. "You will get used to it as you see more." Noyce took a deep breath. "There is nothing to contradict. I was framed by the Holy Church and ended up in this state. I have been in Thornflower Prison for years and I don't believe in God. There is no light in the Holy Church if there is no justice. You are the one who gave me my life. Being loyal to you is my justice." "It seems that I didn't misjudge you." Dean smiled. The process of joining the church will be a bit painful. You will need to peel off your face and replace it with a new one. Can you bear it? The corner of Noy's mouth twitched. As long as I don't die, there is nothing I can't endure. That's good. Dean smiled. In fact, it won't hurt. You just need to have a good sleep. The only thing is that Noyce is dead. Noyce died a long time ago, Noyce muttered. Dean nodded and looked at the town behind him. This is a small nest of the Dark Church in the 8th region. We have the materials we want. You wait here and I'll go and get them. Yes. Noyce nodded. Dean took off his coat and gave it to him. He sneaked into the town alone. The base of the 8th region was located under the manor of a respected squire. He snuck into a farmer's house and took a set of the farmer's clothes, which reeked of sweat and chicken droppings. He put it on and rushed to the squire's manor. 10 minutes later, a figure flew out of the town and appeared by the river like a ghost. Noyce, who was holding Dean's coat, was shocked. He was relieved when he saw Dean. The next moment he smelled a strong smell of blood. Are you hurt? No. Dean took off the farmer's coat that was stained with blood and threw it into the river. He put the package in his hand next to him and squatted by the river to wash his hands. As soon as his hands were in the flowing water, the blood spread from his palms and flowed downstream. Noyce noticed the package. Are these the materials? Yes, the materials and other items to help you change your face, Dean said. He didn't take the alchemy materials as it would inevitably arouse suspicion. After washing his hands, Dean got up and grabbed the package. Let's go and find a place. We will finish it tonight. Noyce subconsciously touched his cheek. There was a bit of stubble on his rough face. He silently nodded and followed behind Dean. Headquarters of the Dark Church in the 9th region. In the luxurious castle of the manor, Hawkeye, dressed in a luxurious black suit, stood on the balcony of the castle and looked into the distance. At this moment, the sky was already bright. The sun on the horizon pressed the darkness tightly on the ground. The place where the sun met was gray, like the ashes of a flame. Hawkeye frowned as he looked at the servant next to him. The night has passed. Haven't you found the elder yet? The attendant said in a trembling voice. We have already investigated. Among the people of the Holy Church, there is no trace of your lordship. There are only 10 disciples led by Trun. Your lordship should have escaped during the battle. At present, there is no news of your lordship. We have contacted all the branches to search everywhere, but there is no news yet. Hawkeye indifferently said, Have you found out why there was a large number of Knights of Light in the streets of Falkland? The subordinate is still investigating. The servant replied carefully. Hawkeye narrowed his eyes. It is best to find out when the sun rises. Otherwise it will be your sunset. The attendant's face turned pale. He lowered his head and said, I'll go now. After saying that, he bowed and excused himself, then turned around and ran away. Hawkeye turned his head and looked down at the street outside the manor. Suddenly he saw 2 figures coming from the corner of the street. They were wearing black robes and hoods. Their faces were shrouded in shadows. He was startled for a moment. With his powerful vision, he suddenly saw one of the figures making a gesture with his hand by the sleeve. Seeing this gesture, Hawkeye was suddenly stunned. He quickly clapped his hands, pressed it on the balcony, turned over and jumped down, and quickly went to the manor. Elder. Hawkeye respectfully said to the figure who made the gesture. Dean gently lifted the hood and revealed the handsome face of the youth. Let's go in first. Yes. Hawkeye respectfully nodded. He glanced at the figure next to Dean. Who is this? His code name is Golden Wolf. He will be my personal attendant in the future, Dean said. Hawkeye was startled as he looked at Golden Wolf. Elder, please. Dean entered the manor first. Accompanied by Hawkeye, they soon came to the headquarters under the manor. In the square outside the hall, the fountain was sprinkling, but there were no people around. At this moment, it was early, and the people who gathered here all returned to their respective residences and began their daytime life. The staff behind the counter yawned as they entered the hall. They were tired from the night work. Dean sat on the chair in his office. He looked at Hawkeye. "Is there anything you want to say to me?" Hawkeye knew what Dean was referring to. He whispered, "Elder, it was our negligence this time. I don't know who leaked your whereabouts, and the Holy Church found you. Fortunately, you weren't hurt. I sent people to look for you all night, but they couldn't find any trace of you. I thought that you were secretly arrested by the Holy Church." Dean lightly tapped his fingers on the table. "It happened before 7:30 in the evening. 10 hours have passed. Haven't you found the traitor yet?" Hawkeye's forehead exuded cold sweat. "Elder, we sent people to look for your traces. There was no detailed investigation of our people. Please give me an hour and I'll give you a reply." "Half an hour?" Dean indifferently said. "Yes." Hawkeye bowed his head. He knew that there was no room for bargaining. The coldness in Dean's eyes disappeared. "Golden Wolf will be my personal attendant and you will be my secretary. I know that you are one of Elder Carey's people. But now Elder Carey has gone to the inner wall. I believe that you should know who you are loyal to. As long as you are loyal to me, I won't treat you badly. Do you understand?" Hawkeye was shocked and hurriedly knelt down on one knee and said, "Sir, I have no disloyalty to you." "Get up." Hawkeye slowly stood up. "Go. I want to know who dared to betray me," Dean said in a cold voice. Chapter 475. Noyce whispered to Dudian after Hawkeye left. "Master, what do I need to do?" "Change the way you address me. Don't call me Master anymore. Just call me like the others." Dudian gently leaned on the chair. "You don't need to do anything. I'll help you reach the peak of Senior Hunter's physique as soon as possible. Your Devourer magic marks won't be afraid of toxins. You will be the one to test my food and drink in the future. Remember not to expose your magic marks so that others will think of more vicious ways to poison you." Noyce replied in a low voice, "I understand, sir." Dudian nodded. He took the risk to bring Noyce to protect himself with the help of the Devourer magic marks. After all, he was confident that he wouldn't lose to anyone in the outer wall. But there was no one in the world who would be so stupid as to fight in an open and above-board duel. Strong people often die in the hands of villains. Let alone him, even 10 times stronger people may die if they encounter a powerful poison. Half an hour passed. Hawkeye came into Dudian's office with a scarred youth. He threw the youth on the carpet and reported, "Elder, the traitor is the one who leaked the information." Dean's eyebrows slightly raised as he looked at the dying youth. Under the cruel torture, his whole body was exposed. His hands seemed to have been smeared with something. His skin was rotten and brown. Some of the flesh and blood had fallen off as if it had been cooked at high temperature, exposing the white phalanges inside. His whole body was trembling, and he couldn't see any teeth in his mouth. He really found a scapegoat. Dudian glanced at Hawkeye. Hawkeye's heart skipped a beat as he saw Dudian's eyes. It seemed that all the secrets in his heart had been seen through. He lowered his eyebrows and looked at the carpet in front of his toes. Dudian intended to hit him to let him know that he wasn't so easy to fool. But he didn't intend to expose him. He looked at the scapegoat. "Why did you betray me? What is the reason?" The young man's body trembled. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. He vaguely said, I was wrong. "Milord, spare me." Dean looked at Hawkeye. "How am I going to ask the person behind him if he can't speak clearly?" Hawkeye's face slightly changed, and he quickly said, "This subordinate was careless, sir, please punish me." "Forget it." Dean waved his hand. "What is this person's identity? Who did he work for? Tell me the truth." Hawkeye bowed his head. "Sir, this person is just a messenger. He has no backing. His father was a knight of the Dark Church, but he died in the war against the Holy Church. His mother also died long ago. He has no relatives." Dean sneered. "No backing, no relationship, how can I be your messenger?" Hawkeye was stunned. You don't want to say, or you didn't check it clearly? Dudian narrowed his eyes. There was anger in his voice. Hawkeye's face turned pale as he said, "This subordinate did not hide anything from you. Please give this subordinate a little more time. This subordinate will definitely find out the mastermind behind him. Time is life. How can I give you so much time?" Dean looked at the young man. "Do you know what kind of sinner colluded with the Holy Church to frame an elder? You will be skinned, your bones will be scraped, and your tendons will be pulled out. Moss eggs will be poured into your mouth, ears, and nostrils. You will be immersed in a pig cage, and you will be sunk into the depths of a water prison. Only when your body is gnawed to death by the hatching moss can you be freed." The young man's pupils dilated as he looked at Dean in horror. "Elder, I'm innocent. I didn't betray you. I really didn't," Dudian indifferently said. "I can spare your life if you tell me who is behind you." Just as Hawkeye said, he had no one to rely on. It was all because of Hawkeye's appreciation that he was able to become a messenger, but Hawkeye didn't recruit him after promoting him. He had been waiting for this day, but he didn't expect that instead of a promotion, he would be forced to confess under torture. Now he had to confess to someone else, but he didn't have any. How could he confess to someone else? "I can guess it even if you don't say it," Dudian indifferently said. "I just imprisoned Amy and you betrayed me. Are you one of Amy's people?" The young man was startled. Hawkeye suddenly turned around and scolded. "Confess, you'd better confess, is that right or not?" When the young man heard the words leniency for those who confess, it was as if he was grasping at the last straw of his life, and he hurriedly said, Yes, it's like this, sure enough, you are one of her people." Dean narrowed his eyes and looked at Hawkeye. "Amy has just been detained by me. How dare you use her people to transmit my whereabouts?" Hawkeye broke out in a cold sweat. He knelt down and said, "My lord, I really don't know when he was bought by Amy. My lord, you must believe me." Dudian coldly stared at him. Hawkeye anxiously looked at Dudian. He wanted to use all the sincerity in his heart to let Dudian know his sincerity and frankness. After looking at each other for a few seconds, he saw that the coldness in Dean's eyes gradually subsided. His taut heart suddenly relaxed, knowing that his sincerity had temporarily won Dean's trust. "I believe you won't do such a stupid thing," Dean said indifferently, and then he changed the topic. "But my carelessness almost put me in danger. This crime is inevitable." Hawkeye was bitter. He knew that he could not escape this disaster. He bowed his head and said, "This subordinate pleads guilty. Please punish me." "Temporarily exempt from punishment," Dudian said in a cold voice. "I hope you can redeem yourself and live up to my expectations." "Yes, sir." Hawkeye was relieved and accepted the order. "The monastery wants me to hide my identity and cooperate with you. But you want me to sacrifice my men to help my enemies." Very good." Dean narrowed his eyes slightly, and the murderous look in his eyes gradually converged into his pupils. His expression also returned to indifference, and no one could tell whether he was happy or angry. He turned the newspaper and continued to read other news. As Sergei said, there was no news or reports about him in the newspaper. It was as if he had completely disappeared from the world. He suddenly felt that it was so easy to erase a person. As long as the whole world united and did not recognize his existence, it would be fine. Who could fight against the whole world? Oh! Dean gently smiled and slowly put down the newspaper. When he was about to look up, he suddenly caught a glimpse of a corner of the newspaper. His eyes suddenly froze, and then his breathing became rapid. Chapter 477. Whoosh! Dean grabbed the newspaper again. He stared at the corner of the newspaper, 72 Ive Street. The owner and his wife committed suicide by poison. It is suspected that they had a dispute with their neighbor which led to depression. He read it word by word, over and over again, without missing a single word. His palm faintly trembled, and each breath he exhaled contained a scorching hot air. Whoa! He suddenly stood up and crushed all the newspapers on the table, including the consortium's newspaper in his hand. Noyce was shocked to see Dean's angry appearance. He had followed Dean for a long time, but he had never seen Dean so angry. Even when Dean was insulted in prison, he didn't have such anger and killing intent. "You stay here," Dean said coldly and strode out of the office. Hawkeye, who had just finished his work, bumped into Dean in the corridor. He was about to greet Dean, but he noticed that the atmosphere wasn't right. He carefully asked, "Elder, that person has been dealt with. What are you going to do?" "I'm going out." Dean brushed past him. The wind swept over Hawkeye's face. Hawkeye felt a chill. "Don't let anyone follow me, or else you won't be able to return." Dean walked out of the corridor like a phantom. Hawkeye was startled as he turned his head. He only saw a corner of Dean's clothes. Dean rode out of the manor and rode a horse. It was a red-brown horse. It was a special horse belonging to the Stantine family, which was behind the 9th Region. He didn't need to show any identification, as he could go to all parts of the outer wall. He could even go to the heavily guarded central area of the commercial district. Go! The healthy horse soared into the sky, as if it was riding on the red dust as it sped away. Dean came to the central area of the commercial district after an hour or so. It was bustling with activity. The streets were overcrowded with pedestrians and vehicles. He came to a relay station and dismounted. He threw the rope to the attendant, who ran up to him and said, "Take good care of it." After saying that, he turned around and entered the street, blending into the crowd. Amidst the bustling crowd, he quickly left the street and arrived at the neighboring street. Along the way, he quickly kneaded his face and changed his face. He grabbed a passerby, knocked him unconscious, and dragged him into an alley. Then, he stripped him of his clothes and changed them. After the disguise was done, he flipped over the alleyway and quickly left for the other side of the central district. After a quarter of an hour, Dean arrived at address 72 of Ives Street. He saw a spacious manor with a beautiful environment in front of him. Outside the manor, there was a carriage of magistrate. The carriage was reinforced with steel. It was full of iron and blood. A knight of the magistrate was leaning on the carriage. He was holding a piece of bread in his hand and was chewing it in a depressed manner. Inside the manor, there was a figure who seemed to be busy with something. From the air, Dean smelled the strong pungent smell of blood and the smell of rotting corpses. Even after being diluted by the air, the smell didn't disperse for a long time. Even ordinary people could easily smell it, but it wasn't as strong as his. It penetrated deep into the lungs and bone marrow. Dean's heart sank. It was like falling into a cold frost lake. The chill penetrated into his blood. Whoosh! His figure disappeared into the street. The next moment, Dean's figure appeared on the top floor of the 3rd floor of the manor. He gently opened the skylight and slowly walked in. He saw the dust floating in the sunlight on the 3rd floor. It was obvious that it hadn't been cleaned for a long time. He was silent for a moment. He slowly walked to the 2nd floor step by step. His movement was like a ghost and didn't make the slightest sound. He went down to the 2nd floor and saw that the living room was in chaos. The pillows on the sofa were randomly thrown to the ground. It seemed that they had been ransacked by robbers. In the corner of the living room there was a new textile machine. The light shone on it and the dust was floating. At the moment, the figure in the villa was busy on the 1st floor. He seemed to be moving something, making a dragging sound. Dean bit his lips slightly and quietly walked to the stairs. He suddenly saw a knight of the magistrate wearing several layers of gloves and a mask. His nostrils were bulging. It seemed that the mask alone was not enough to block his breathing. He squatted on the ground and kept retreating. His hands were dragging something. It was a corpse, a seriously rotten corpse. The corpse was a little swollen and already had livor mortis. His cheeks were full of scars from sharp blades, and there was a pool of blood near his ears. His ears had been cut off, and all his clothes had been stripped off. His towering chest and belly were full of whip marks. It wasn't hard to imagine what kind of torture he had gone through. The moment he saw the face of the corpse, Dean's mind went blank. He stood there in a daze. This face belonged to his adoptive mother, Jura. The last glimmer of hope in his heart was instantly shattered. It was as if he had fallen into the abyss. His whole body was cold. This villa was the place where he had ordered people to pick up Jura and her husband. The house had been transferred to Jura and her husband. Therefore, the moment he saw the news in the newspaper, his heart had been hanging in the air. Until now, his heart had sunk deeply. His mind was in chaos. He stood there in a daze. Jura's body was dragged by the night on the smooth wooden floor. Jura's eyes were wide open. They were full of panic and anger. She was like a sculpture. Her neck was tilted as she looked at Dean, who was at the stairs. Little by little, she disappeared from the wall until her whole body was dragged out of the villa. Chapter 478. Soon, the previous night dragged Jura's body out and returned to the living room. He went straight to the bottom of the stairs without noticing. If he turned his head and looked up at the top of the stairs, he would see a distorted face. He bent down and quickly pulled out another body. It was a middle-aged man. His chest was pierced by a table leg. There were many scars on his body. His eyes were wide open. When he was dragged past the entrance of the staircase, the young knight felt a little uncomfortable holding his breath. He exhaled lightly and suddenly felt something. He turned his head to look at the staircase, but it was empty. There was only a beam of light shining from the window at the top of the staircase, reflecting on the steps and dust floating in the light. He was relieved. It was just an illusion. He thought someone was here. He didn't dare to delay any longer. He grabbed the male corpse and continued to move it. In this dark room, where there were only corpses, even though he had been influenced by the Holy Church, he still felt a little scared. His hair stood on end, as if there were invisible ghosts staring at him in the dark. Soon, the second body was moved out. He quickly ran back, bent down and stood up. This time he did not drag the body on the ground. It was a child, 8 or 9 years old. The child's eyes were gouged out and one of his hands was broken. He died miserably. He carried the child's rotten leg, held his breath, and left quickly. He did not notice Dean, who had appeared at the staircase next to him. "Captain, the body has been moved out." A voice came from outside the door. "Oh, I'm coming." There was a response from the carriage outside the manor, and the sound of footsteps gradually approached. It stinks." "Yes, the body is like this. How many days has it been since he died?" The youth who had moved the body said from the mask. The previous captain said, "Don't worry about it. It is too smelly. Quickly put it in the body bag." "Captain, aren't we doing this job together? Go to hell. Do you want to die? I told you to do it." While the two were talking at the door, Dean slowly walked down the stairs step by step. His mouth was closed, and there was no expression on his face. Shrouded in darkness, his face could not be seen clearly. He did not make the slightest sound as he walked. When he reached the last step of the stairs, he slowly turned his head and looked at the living room where the youth had previously dragged the corpse. Suddenly, he saw a hellish picture. In the messy living room, there were putrid bloodstains everywhere. It seemed like a chaotic battle had broken out in the living room. All the decorations had been knocked over, and there were a few large pools of blood on the floor. One of the largest was beside the table, and it was obviously the place where Gray's chest had been pierced. Dean's eyes were dark, without a trace of fluctuation, as if all the flames reflected in his eyes would be swallowed by the darkness. He looked at them silently. His rich hunting experience was automatically organized in his mind. Through the bloodstains on the ground, he seemed to vaguely see the shadows of Jura and the others when they were alive. He could see the scene of the riot and death. 3 people were struggling. Jura was tied up. There was more than one person at the scene. Obviously, even a blind person could see that this was not a suicide, but an extremely brutal killing. He slowly walked closer and turned his head to look around. Judging from the familiar rotten smell of the corpses, the time of death of the 3 people was not 1 or 2 days, but at least half a month. Now it was the middle of the black snow season, and the temperature was extremely low, but he could still smell such a strong stench. It could be seen that they had died for a long time. Who killed them? Dean's eyes were dark and empty, without the slightest killing intent or anger, but a kind of seeping silence. It stinks. Let's go. I don't have an appetite for breakfast. At this time, the captain's voice and footsteps came from outside the door. Dean slowly turned his head and looked at the 2 people leaving through the gap of the window. The youth who had previously dragged the corpses was carrying 3 body bags, and said to the captain in front of him, "Captain, this should be a vendetta. They died so miserably. Why did you say it was suicide?" "Shut up. You talk too much," the captain in front of him said angrily. "This is the matter of the higher-ups. If the higher-ups say it was suicide, then it was suicide. Are you the judge or are they the judge? We just do our job. If you want to promote, you have to talk less. You have to learn to turn a blind eye to a lot of things. Otherwise, you can only be a corpse carrier in this life." Turn a blind eye? Captain, do you think this is an injustice? Are you looking for a beating? Yes, I won't ask. The 2 put the body bags in the car and drove away. Dean took back his eyes. His figure slightly flashed and disappeared from the living room. The next moment, his figure appeared in the nearby Manor 73 and knocked on the door. The door was opened and a strong man came out. He squinted at Dean. "Who are you looking for?" "I heard that the family next door had an accident. Do you know when it happened?" Dean asked. His voice was hoarse. When the strong man heard this, his face sank. "It's none of your business," he said, and tried to close the door, but he couldn't. Dean raised his hand to hold the door. His deep black eyes shot out 2 cold lights. The strong man shivered. He felt that the temperature of the air suddenly dropped by more than 10 degrees. It was so cold that he wanted to shiver. "Tell me what you know," Dean said word by word. The strong man swallowed his saliva. He felt as if there was an invisible death scythe on his neck. He said in a trembling voice, I really don't know. I only know that half a month ago it was raining. It seemed that a group of people came to the house. At that time, I heard loud screams, and then for a long time afterwards, I didn't see the family appear. Until recently, a passerby smelled the smell of rotten corpses and reported the matter to the magistrate. When the magistrate arrived yesterday to investigate, I learned that the whole family committed suicide by poison. Half a month ago, Dean suddenly remembered something. His mouth slightly trembled. Half a month ago, he looked for Jura to treat him. He was silent. After a moment, he slowly turned around and said, "Don't tell anyone that I asked you. Otherwise, your family will also commit suicide by poison." The strong man's legs trembled. He saw from Dean's eyes that the other side was not joking. He said in a trembling voice, I won't talk about it." Dean glanced at the direction where the carriage left. His figure flashed and disappeared like a phantom. The strong man saw this scene and was scared to the point of screaming. He raised his hand to cover his mouth. He didn't dare to make a sound. He hurriedly closed the door tightly. He made up his mind to immediately move away from this unlucky and dangerous place. It didn't take long for Dean to track the previous carriage. Perhaps it was because of the corpses in the carriage. The carriage did not travel along the commercial street. Instead, it drove to a remote path in the suburbs. At this moment, snowflakes were gradually falling from the sky, and the secluded path became even more desolate. When the carriage moved, it made squeaking sounds, as if the skeletons of the dead were chewing something. Dean followed them from a distance. Soon he understood where they were going to drag the bodies of Jura and her husband. 10 minutes later, the carriage came in front of a towering snow-capped mountain. The mountainside was covered with black snow. The top of the mountain was covered with brown stones. This was one of the 3 major volcanoes in the outer wall area. It was also a natural crematorium in the commercial district. The cemetery was expensive in the commercial district. Most of the ordinary people couldn't afford it. They didn't dare to dirty the public land. So they cremated the corpses of their relatives in the Shiva volcano. Shiva volcano meant heaven in the ancient language. It was the blessing of the people to be buried here. The carriage arrived outside the Shiva volcano. 2 knights took out the 3 body bags from the carriage and carried them to the volcano. Dean followed them like a ghost. The 2 of them seemed to be a little tired after carrying the body bag halfway. The captain looked back at the young knight who was gasping for breath. He thought for a moment and said, "Forget it, let's find a magma pool nearby and bury them." The young knight was relieved and followed the captain to find a magma pool nearby. There were a few stone tombstones around the magma pool, and they were all crooked. The captain said, "Throw them here." The young knight threw the body bags into the magma pool. Dean looked at them in the dark. His eyes were cold and his fingers slightly clenched into fists, but he did not move. With his strength, it would be effortless to kill these 2 people. But if these 2 people died, his identity would inevitably be exposed, and everything would be over. He was so angry that his heart trembled, yet he had to endure it. What kind of feeling was this? How much anger was there in life that could be vented in time? How much grievances could be turned into the deepest hatred? In the blink of an eye, the 3 body bags were thrown into the slowly flowing magma pool. But they didn't sink. The depth of the magma pool seemed to be very shallow. "Let's go. It's so hot." The captain waved his hand as he wanted to fan himself. The young knight looked at the slowly sinking body bags and followed them. Chapter 479. Utopia Mountain. It was the most famous mountain in the commercial district and even in the entire outer wall. It was the headquarters of the Holy Church. The mountain was 580 meters high, with steep cliffs and rugged mountains. It was covered with brilliant snow-white sunflowers. Every time black snow fell, the flowers would bloom even more beautifully. Not only would the thick black snow not freeze these delicate flowers to death, it would make them bloom even more brilliantly and beautifully. Thus it was named Sunflower. The first pontiff recognized the unyielding and indomitable quality of the Holy Church. Therefore, it was designated as the Holy Flower of the Holy Church. It was engraved on the back of every holy emblem. It symbolized the will to pursue the light. Because of this, the value of the sunflowers also rose, and they could not be carelessly destroyed or planted. Once the flowers were damaged, the grower would be heavily punished. Over time, no one dared to plant the sunflowers, much less touch them. They could only look at them from afar. On the steps of the Piazza San Marco at the top of Mount Udo, an old man sat quietly. He wore a luxurious robe studded with gems, and he held a scepter embedded with a fist-sized snow-white gem. He looked into the distance silently. "Boys! Boys!" In the vast and silent square, an anxious woman's voice suddenly rang out. The old man slowly turned his head to look, and immediately saw an 8 or 9-year-old little boy, holding a wooden sword, angrily walking over. Behind him was a graceful woman wearing a nun's robe, shouting anxiously, "Grandpa Pope, I want to duel with you." The little boy's figure was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in front of the old man. He looked down at the old man sitting on the steps with a face full of anger. "Boys!" The nun hurriedly pulled the boy. She bowed to the old man. "Your Holiness, I didn't discipline him properly. I will take Boyce back." She tried to pull the little boy's hand. However, there was a huge disparity in strength. She couldn't pull the little boy. The Pope faintly smiled and raised his hand to stop her actions. He looked at the little boy. "You want to duel with me?" "Yes," Boyce angrily replied. "Your Holiness, He is just joking. Don't take it to heart. The nun hurriedly looked at Boyce and said, You're too rude. Quickly apologized to Grandpa Pontiff. Do you know what you're doing? The Pope was interested and asked the little boy, Why do you want to duel? Because I am very angry. This reason seemed reasonable, especially coming from the mouth of a little boy. Boyce. The nun was so frightened that she hurriedly tugged at him. How can you talk nonsense to His Holiness the Pope? Quickly apologize. The Pope raised his hand to stop her. He smiled faintly and said, I like to listen to angry words. Boyce, tell me, why are you angry? When the nun heard this, she could only let go and step aside with a bitter smile. She kept signaling the little boy with her eyes, but the little boy completely ignored her. Boyce angrily said, Grandpa Pope, you said that I can go down the mountain to play after passing the test. Why didn't you keep your word? I want to duel with you. The instructor said that if I defeat others, others will listen to me. Humph, I will defeat you. The nun almost fainted when she heard this. Her face was pale and her body was shivering. The Pope, however, smiled lightly. He was not angry at all. I never go back on my words. Do you still remember what I said? I said, when you can defeat the gospel instructor, I'll allow you to leave the mountain. As far as I know, you tricked the gospel instructor into eating your diarrhea medicine. That's how you defeated him, right? This kind of method is not honorable enough. At the end of his words, his face was slightly stiff, but the corners of his eyes were still smiling. Naturally, he did not have any dignity. Boyce's neck shrunk as he heard this. Embarrassment flashed on his face. But soon he raised his head and said, I didn't use diarrhea medicine. I defeated him with my own strength. You will be the most outstanding Knight of Light in the future. Don't learn to lie, the Pope said in a serious tone. Boyce felt the seriousness of the Pope's tone. But he was young, so he had long regarded his face as more important than anything else. He didn't want to bow his head. He stubbornly raised his head. I didn't lie. I didn't give him diarrhea medicine. Speaking up to this point, she muttered in a low voice, with his body, how can taking some diarrhea medicine make his stomach ache? The Pope was dumbfounded. He shook his head and smiled. No matter what, you have to defeat him in an honorable manner. Do you understand? Boyce pouted. Grandpa Pope, why can't I go down the mountain? You are unfair. The Pope gently touched his head. Silly boy, you are different from others. In the future you will become the most powerful person in the Holy Church. You will become the strongest person in the entire outer wall. Boyce pouted. I will be bored to death by that time. The Pope was dumbfounded. The nun saw that the Pope wasn't angry. Instead, he was in a good mood. She took the opportunity to say, Pontiff, Boyce is not sensible. Please forgive his rude behavior. The Pope smiled and put his hand on Boyce's shoulder. Children get angry. You have to grow up quickly, understand? Boyce saw that Dudian was serious. He thought for a moment, then nodded. I will grow up as soon as possible. I will whip the gospel instructor every day and make him beg for mercy every day. The Pope couldn't help but laugh. It seemed that he had already imagined the scene. He secretly mourned for the gospel instructor for a second. Grandpa Pope, why are you always sitting here? Boyce curiously asked. The Pope smiled and turned to look at the vast St. Mark's Square in front of him. At the end of the square was an even wider area. Countless buildings were scattered all over the ground. He said softly, the scenery here is the best. Hawkeye was pacing back and forth on the balcony of the manor. Suddenly he saw a figure coming from the street. It was Dean. Hawkeye's eyes lit up as he rushed out of the balcony to greet Dean. Elder, you are finally back. Something happened. Our branch was swallowed by the 8th region. He didn't finish his words, because Dean raised his hand. His action was to shut him up. Dean was expressionless and silent. He walked into the manor and followed the passage to the underground headquarters. A woman passed by and almost bumped into him. After seeing Dean's face, she hurriedly apologized. Hawkeye scolded, "Bastard! Don't you want to live?" Dean had gone far and returned to his office. "Elder, you are back." Noyce stood up as he saw Dean. Hawkeye gently closed the door. He was about to continue his report when Dean opened his mouth. "From now on, you and the other 14 council members will be responsible for the matters of the 9th region. You will vote to decide." Hawkeye was stunned. "Prepare an alchemy room for me." Dean sat on the chair and put the ashes to the side. He picked up the pencil and wrote down a string of materials. "From now on no one is allowed to disturb me without my permission. Do you understand?" Hawkeye was startled. "Elder, what are you doing? You don't understand?" "Yes, I understand." Hawkeye was somewhat puzzled. "It's just that the decisions of the 9th District have always been made by you and the other councilors. Didn't you say that you want to make the 9th District the 5th District in half a year? If you don't do anything then I'm afraid the people below will. Whoever has an opinion can come to me." Dean indifferently said, "The previous promise won't change. The 9th region will become one of the top 5 regions in 6 months. You don't have to worry about it." Hawkeye couldn't figure out Dean. "Elder, the 8th region. I said that you will deal with everything. There will be a total of 15 people, including you, so the voting won't be deadlocked." Dean picked up the paper and handed it to Hawkeye. "Prepare these materials and send them to my alchemy room. Remember to use the best alchemy room." Hawkeye quickly took the paper and glanced at it. He found that most of the materials were metal materials. There were also some gelatinous materials. He was puzzled as he didn't know what Dean was going to make. But at least he knew that his master was an alchemist. Noyce was standing on the side. He had followed Dean for a long time. He was aware that Dean's situation wasn't right when he came back. He saw that Dean was going to refine things. His mind couldn't help but think of the super shark spear and the cannon that Dean had made. He also remembered the 2 legendary items that were spread throughout the outer wall. Chapter 480. In addition, check the situation of the barbarians. Dean continued. "I want to know the institutional structure of the barbarians as well as the information of all the members of the barbarian royal family, including their preferences in life." Barbarians? Hawkeye was startled. He didn't expect Dean to extend his hand to the barbarians outside the wall. Although he didn't know what Dean was going to do, but it was obviously not a trivial matter. Hawkeye resisted the urge to ask, "Yes, Elder. Go." Hawkeye left the office. Dean took out a piece of paper from the side and replaced it with a sharpened pencil. His hand quickly skimmed over the paper. The outline of the pencil sketch suddenly emerged. There were 2 different faces. Dean handed the paper to Noyce. "You personally keep an eye on them." Noyce took a glance and remembered their faces. He asked in confusion, "Sir, who are they?" "Knights from the magistrate in Thusso Avenue." Dean's indifferent eyes flashed. "Remember, don't let them detect you. If they are killed, follow the killer and find the person behind it." Noyce was confused, but he knew that Dean didn't tell him anything else. There was no use in asking, so he honestly agreed. Dean was silent for a moment. He grabbed the bundle next to him and gave it to him. "Find a cemetery to bury this." Noyce was startled. "What is this?" "Ashes." Noyce's face slightly changed. "Ashes? Did something happen to Sergei?" "It's my adoptive parents." Dean's eyes were dark and cold. "They had an accident. Someone wants to inquire about me through their mouth. Choose a good location and bury them. Remember, don't engrave anything on the tombstone. Just erect a wordless tombstone." Noyce was shocked. They had an accident? How? He couldn't help but recall the faces of Jura and her husband. Dean had entrusted him to personally bring them to the commercial district. He didn't expect that the modest couple would be killed. No wonder Dean left in a hurry. No wonder he came back like a different person. His body was exuding killing intent like a volcano that would erupt at any time. Did these two do it? Noyce looked at the portrait in his hand and couldn't help but feel angry. Dean's eyes were dark. They are just two minions. They don't have the guts to do such a thing. The person who ruled the verdict should know something about the situation, but not too much. Elder, I will assassinate them, Noyce said in an angry tone. Dean shook his head. Don't beat the grass to scare the snake. They are just scapegoats. I want to catch the person who did it. Noyce suddenly thought of a target. Is it the Mel family? It's unlikely. Dean narrowed his eyes. This person should have no enmity with me. The biggest reason why he wanted to use them to get information about me is because of my ability as a master. He wanted to get hold of my weakness so that he could threaten me in the future. But it's obvious that they didn't let go, so, as he said that, the hellish scene in the living room appeared in his mind again, and an extremely strong killing intent flashed across his eyes. This killing intent filled his eyes, causing his expression to be somewhat sinister. But in the next moment the killing intent quickly disappeared, and his tightly clenched fists slowly relaxed. Noyce instinctively wanted to retreat as he saw the killing intent on Dean's face. Even though he knew that Dean wouldn't hurt him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of panic. Fortunately, Dean restrained his killing intent quickly. Noyce stopped his footstep. He felt that he couldn't breathe. Elder, how do you know that they didn't let you go? In case the enemy knows about you, Dean interrupted Noyce. I wouldn't be sitting here if they let me go. Jura had told him that the Holy Church would isolate him once the ice blood disease was discovered. If someone knew about his weakness, then they could easily control him. Based on this point alone, he knew that Jura didn't disclose this matter. Because of this, the pain in his heart was heavier. Noyce was startled and became silent. Go. Dean closed his eyes wearily. Noyce glanced at him, picked up the ashes, bowed, and left quietly. Dudian slowly opened his eyes after Noyce left. The previous tiredness was gone. He took the paper and began to draw the blueprint of the new invention. In the conference room. What? He doesn't care? We will decide the future by voting. Others have come to our door, but he is scared. It's the first time I've seen such an elder. Don't quarrel. Isn't it the same if we vote? Yes, I believe that the elder has his reasons. 14 counselors argued fiercely. Several of them supported Dean. One of them was Angelia, who had been punished by Dean. Hawkeye smiled slightly. He had already expected such a situation. He raised his hand and said, Everyone, this time the 8th region wants to swallow our 13th branch. Although the 13th branch doesn't have many resources and the terrain is remote, but it is the border of our 9th region. Once they tear it open, there will be more trouble in the future. Moreover, if we endure this time, the other regions will dare to treat us casually. Nonsense, of course we can't. Tamaka had a fiery temper and rolled his eyes. Yes, the 8th region is deliberately provoking us. They have been eyeing that place for a long time. Everyone, are we going to sacrifice or protect? Let's make our stance clear. Of course we will protect. Most of the council expressed their support to protect the 13th branch. Only 4 or 5 people didn't express their views, and one person held the idea of abandoning the 13th branch. Hawkeye, didn't the elder say that he would lead the 9th region to become one of the top 5 regions in 6 months? A woman dressed in an enchanting dress said, How long has it been? Why are you retreating now? Do you think it's impossible? Don't be like this even if you can't do it. Hawkeye didn't expect that the topic would be brought up again. He bitterly smiled. The elder said that he will definitely fulfill his promise. Within 6 months, our 9th region will become one of the top 5 regions. There is still a long time before the deadline. Everyone, please be patient. Today we will only talk about the 13th branch. Chapter 481. Time passed in a flash. 2 days passed. The outer wall was calm on the surface, but there were turbulent waves in the dark. After voting, the 9th Division finally chose to go to war with the 8th Division. They took back the 13th Division that had been looted, and Tamaka personally led a team to guard and rebuild it. This kind of large-scale conflict often happened, especially between the neighboring divisions that had a conflict of resources. It was inevitable that they would either cooperate or have conflict. While the 13th Division was being rebuilt, Dean was immersed in an alchemy room of the highest specifications in the headquarters of the 9th Division. He was immersed in studying his new divine incantation. Before the new divine incantation was completed, he had decided not to interfere with the affairs of the 9th Division. Whether it was the loss of profits or the annexation of territories, it had nothing to do with him. When he first took office, he didn't care about the affairs of the 9th region, as he didn't want to divert his energy. After all, no matter how well the people of the 9th district did, they were only working for the monastery and the Radiant Church. But the new invention was different. It was his own thing. Moreover, this new invention would be the strongest weapon in his hands. He would be able to take revenge for Jura and her husband once it was completed. He would be able to plan to overthrow the inner wall and break the shackles of the shackles. Since there must be someone who would become the king, then why not do it himself? In a dark hall located in the underground. 2 days have passed. Why haven't they made a move? A figure wearing a white devil mask spoke in a hoarse voice. His voice was like dry and cracked leaves, and it caused one to be unable to help but get goosebumps and feel a chill. A graceful figure was kneeling in front of him. She whispered, "The law enforcers have been tracking them. Except for normal colleagues, no one else has contact with them." The white-faced evil spirit raised his head slightly, and his deep eyes revealed a trace of coldness. He said, "It seems that the newly appointed elder is not the genius oracle who disappeared. The old fellows of the mystic sect, it's rare to see a talent like this." The graceful figure bowed her head in silence. "Go and clean up. Don't leave any traces," the white mask indifferently said. The graceful figure respectfully replied, "Yes." Knock. Dudian was engraving the drawings of a part when there was a knock on the door. He frowned slightly and turned around. His slightly focused pupils penetrated through the thick door and saw a human-shaped heat outline. He immediately recognized that it was noise from the intensity of the heat. He let go of the pen, got up, twisted the valve on the side of the door, and opened the door. "Elder!" The trash-can lid was stained with leftover food and gave off a rancid smell. Even if someone found the clothes, they would not be able to smell the original smell on them. Whoosh! Dean quickly left the bustling area and came to the front of the Golden Wall. At the moment, the Golden Wall had been repaired by many workers. It had been restored and strengthened a lot. There were soldiers patrolling back and forth on the wall. The barbarians were still entrenched in the Red Maple Mountains. The military didn't dare to relax the defense of the Golden Wall. Dean took a look, but didn't force his way through. He turned around and went around the giant wall. The edge of the giant wall was sparsely populated. It was a large wasteland. The closer to the giant wall, the stronger the radiation. So there were almost no people living in this area. Dean took off his coat. The wings on his back stretched out from the transparent skin film. They quickly became thin and hard. They were as sharp as knives. They flapped under his control and soared into the air. After flying to the giant wall, he ran through the Golden Wall's guard range and landed again. He entered the suburbs outside the Golden Wall. This place used to be the territory of the people inside the wall. But now it was deserted. All the villages and towns were as empty as a ghost village. Only houses were left standing in the dark. It was a horrible scene. Dean shuttled through the deserted towns and went straight to the Red Maple Mountains. Cliff. Yvette was sitting on the edge of the cliff. She could hear the rumbling sound of the waterfall. It was permanent, so it was easy to ignore it. Amidst the loud rumbling, she looked up at the faint starlight in the night sky, a little lost in thought. With the help of Glenn, she had sneaked back from the Golden Wall. However, after not seeing her for a short period of time, Her hometown and clansmen suddenly became somewhat unfamiliar, especially her brothers and sisters. In the past, they would always play and laugh together, practice swordsmanship, horse riding, and archery together, but now when they saw her, they all avoided her, as if she was infected with a plague that could spread at any time. She felt lonely. She knew what they were worried about. She was arrested, but she came back safe and sound. It didn't make sense. Although she explained the reason to her father, but she felt that her father didn't believe her. "I'm not a spy. Even if they don't believe me, I'm clear about it." Yvette thought to herself, as long as I don't do anything like a spy, they will naturally believe that I am not a spy after a long time. Bang! The daggers collided with each other, creating sparks. Yvette's arm shook violently and she almost fell into the cliff behind her. "Who is it?" The people patrolling in the distance heard the noise and shouted, rushing over quickly. Dean hesitated for a moment but turned around and ran away. Yvette turned around to see Dean's face. Although the light was dim, but the barbarians had excellent night vision. Although Dean raised his hand to cover his face, but Yvette was still able to see his face. She couldn't help but be shocked. Whoosh! Dean quickly left and disappeared into the night. Soon, several patrolling barbarian guards came over. They were surprised to see Yvette on the edge of the cliff. "Princess, just now," Yvette recovered and waved her hand. "It's nothing. It seems that we saw someone run away." The guard looked at her suspiciously. Yvette said in a gloomy tone, "Someone wanted to assassinate me. Fortunately, you came in time." The guards were surprised. "Someone wanted to assassinate you? Who is so bold?" "Princess, did you see his face?" The face flashed in Yvette's mind. She would never forget that face. "I didn't see it clearly." The guards looked at each other. One of them immediately said, "Princess, it's getting late. You should go back and rest. We will immediately inform all the checkpoints to find this person." Yvette nodded. The guards quickly split up and left. "He is one of us. How can you find him?" Yvette looked at the guards who left. There was a trace of bitterness in her mouth. "I don't have a rebellious heart. Why do you have to force me? Why can't time prove my innocence? Why?" A whoosh! Dean went straight to a dangerous place in the Red Maple Mountains. The terrain was steep and breathtaking. Even a senior hunter like Yvette would find it difficult to climb down. Such a dangerous terrain was the main reason why the Red Maple Mountains were easy to defend and difficult to attack. He spread his wings and flew out from this place, disappearing into the night. More than 10 minutes later, when he flew out of the Red Maple Mountains, he slowly landed in the wilderness. He raised his hand and rubbed his face to restore his original appearance. As for the face he fabricated before, it was the servant of a member of the barbarian royal family that he asked Hawkeye to investigate. This barbarian royal family member was Yvette's brother. He had a high authority in the royal family and gathered strong barbarians from various tribes. And the one he fabricated was one of the more outstanding Bear Tribe's savage expert. "Yvette, don't blame me. I can't allow failure. You must become a king and become my chess piece." Dean clenched his fist. The night wind blew and he felt a bit cold. He turned his head to look at the direction of the Red Maple Mountain. After a while, he slowly withdrew his gaze, wiped the blood off the dagger, put it back to the leggings, and ran forward. Sergei glanced at him. "You can't eat the flesh of the monster. Do you understand?" Sergei woke up and wanted to slap his head. He was a senior hunter. How could he forget about this? He immediately said, "I know. However, this thing's body can only be preserved until this season. Once the black snow season is over, it will rot. You don't have to worry about it. I have a way to continue freezing it," Dean said indifferently. He turned back with 2 sharp limbs that were more than 10 meters long. These 2 limbs looked thin, but they were not light. Each of them weighed at least 1,000 pounds, as if they were made of lead and iron. Fortunately, with his current physique, this weight was nothing, and he could easily lift them. Dean put the two limbs aside and looked at Sergei. Do you have a rope? Yes. Sergei quickly took out a bundle of rope from the shack. Dean spread his wings and flew straight to the giant wall. Sergei's pupils shrank as he stared at the scene. He finally understood how Dean sneaked out of the inner wall. He had a pair of wings. No wonder he could quietly come out of the giant wall. Looking at Dean flying to the giant wall in the blink of an eye, he was excited. Flying had always been the ability of gods. He didn't expect that Dean, as a mortal, could also have this ability. Obviously, this was the magic mark ability of the big guy. Rare magic marks don't have such ability. It must be a legendary magic mark. He said that he didn't absorb it. He is too cunning. Sergei was secretly envious. Dean landed on the giant wall. He untied the rope and tied it to the edge of the giant wall. He flew down and landed in front of Sergei. You will temporarily live outside the giant wall. If there is any urgent matter, then you can sneak back directly from the giant wall. Sergei nodded as he looked at Sergei. After you get to the giant wall, go to the corner and go straight along the edge of the giant wall. There is too much radiation near the giant wall, so no one from the Holy Church is stationed there. As for how to cross the golden wall, you will have to rely on yourself. Sergei's eyes lit up as he looked at the rope that was dozens of meters high. He was excited. He didn't expect that one day he would be able to climb the giant wall and see the scenery above. So we don't have to stay in the holy house for a week. That's great. Sergei grinned. Dean nodded slightly. Although there were people from the 9th region in the Holy House and the Holy Church who could use their privileges to let Sergei go back, but it was easy to expose his identity. I'll go back first. Pay attention to yourself. Dean bent down and picked up the two blade-like limbs from the ground. He spread his wings and flew up at an extremely fast speed. The two blade-like limbs that weighed 1,000 pounds did not affect his flying speed at all. It could be seen how strong the seemingly thin wings were. Nightingale was overjoyed as she looked at the middle-aged man. Teacher, he praised me just now. The black-robed middle-aged man hurriedly shushed him and said, Lower your voice. You have to call him elder. Nightingale curiously said, Teacher, the elder of our 9th region is so young. He doesn't look more than 25 years old. He is amazing. Don't talk nonsense. Wait until we go back. The middle-aged man shouted. Nightingale saw that the middle-aged man was strict but didn't dare to say anything. The stall owner at the side saw her confused look, smiled, and said, Little girl, you might not know this, but the counselors and elders all have ways to maintain their youthful looks. Don't be fooled by the fact that the elder looks like he's in his 20s. He might actually be older than your grandfather. Nightingale was startled and said, Are you serious? The middle-aged man frowned. He wanted to scold her but held back. You will know when you go back and ask your teacher. The stall owner smiled and said, The elder is very knowledgeable and has extraordinary methods. How could a 20-year-old brat do that? You know too little. Nightingale exclaimed in her heart, Thank you for telling me this. It's nothing. The stall owner smiled and said, Although I don't know how Lord Elder saw that you're not bad, but since you've received Lord Elder's appreciation, your future is boundless. You might even be stronger than your teacher. If you're promoted in the future, please take care of my business. Nightingale sweetly said, I will. But my teacher is very powerful. I won't be able to learn his knowledge in a lifetime. The middle-aged man's face eased a bit as he heard this. There was a trace of gratification in his smile. The stall owner smiled, not taking it to heart. Dean met Hawkeye as he came to the second floor of the hall. He immediately said, You are here. Come with me. Yes. Hawkeye quietly looked at Dudien's night clothes and immediately followed. Back to the office, Dean wrote down an address and gave it to him. Go to this place and bring back 2 things. It's a monster's body. It's about 10 meters long. Be sure to send it here safely. Hawkeye was startled. Yes. He took the note and respectfully excused himself. Dean put on his alchemy clothes after Hawkeye left. It was the professional clothes of a 5-star alchemist. It could block most of the radiation from alchemy materials. It could even resist the radiation from outside the giant wall. The cost was extremely expensive. He returned to the alchemy room after putting on the new clothes. He continued to work on his new invention. This time the new invention was different from the past. The project was huge, and he could only make it by himself. Although the technical content of some of the parts wasn't high and could be completed by other alchemists, but it was easy to leak the information to the Pope and the monastery. He used to love theurgy, but now that he's given some power to be in charge of others, he's not used to it yet. Let's wait for him to wake up and taste the taste of power. He'll work hard. Although it'll be a little late, it's also a kind of experience. Yes, sir, Francis replied. However, Milam, that old thing, is disobedient. Let's teach him a lesson. Otherwise, he'll think that we're all blind. The corner of the elder's mouth revealed a hint of coldness. You know what to do, right? Francis felt a chill in his heart and said in a low voice, I understand. Go. The elder waved his hand. Francis didn't dare to hesitate. He quickly turned around and left. The elder smiled and looked at the hanging young man in front of him. You have rested for a long time. Have you thought about it? The young man closed his eyes. His face was covered with blood. He struggled to breathe and didn't answer. There is no mouth that I can't pry open. The elder smiled faintly and said, As long as you are willing to tell me the formula, all of your pain will disappear. You will also have a large amount of money and beauties to enjoy until you die in your old age. You know me, I always keep my word. What's the point of persisting here? The Demonic Creature Research Institute won't accept your kindness. The corner of the young man's mouth twitched, and he slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were full of exhaustion. He glanced at him and said slowly, Dog of the One God sect, you want to get the formula of the abyss. Why don't you go to the God Nation and ask for it yourself? The elder narrowed his eyes and shook his head with a smile. I like people like you. It's challenging. Then he snapped his fingers. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dean came out of the alchemy room. Noyce was well aware of the time when Dean would come out, so he prepared the breakfast in advance. He personally tasted the food and confirmed that it was not poisonous before giving it to Dean. Dean read the newspaper while eating breakfast. He wanted to understand the recent changes. From the information in the newspaper, it seemed that the military had recovered a bit. They were ready to continue to expel barbarians to the radiation wilderness outside the fortress. Dean's eyes lit up as he quietly finished breakfast. He asked Noyce to bring his armor. How long will it take to polish the weapon? I heard from the masters that the material is too hard. It will take a few days to insert the handle, Noyce replied. Dean didn't expect it to be so fast. Supervise them and ensure the quality. Yes. Dean wore the armor and needed the face of an ordinary youth. He put on the mask and left. Hawkeye, who was in the hall on the first floor, came forward. Elder, what are you doing? I'm going out. Dean's footsteps didn't stop as he left the 9th region. A few hours later, Dean's figure appeared on the giant wall. He flew along the spacious aisle and went straight to the western corner of the giant wall. He flew down in advance as he was about to reach the western corner. He retracted his wings after landing and rushed to the western corner. The sun was hanging high in the sky. It was a rare sunny day. He glanced around but didn't see Aisha's figure. Obviously he was one step ahead of her. He didn't mind. He casually found a clean rock and sat down, waiting quietly. There are a lot of monsters around here. Dean casually looked around. If it wasn't for his excellent self-preservation ability, he would have been scared to find a place to hide. There were huge red figures exuding exuberant heat in the surrounding area. Judging from the local concentration of heat, They were not inferior to senior hunters such as Sergei. Most of them were level 30 or so monsters. She saw that Dean hadn't caught up with her, so she waved back. "Hurry up!" Dean reacted and quickly followed her. He had the protection of the armor, so he directly passed through the grass. He didn't care about the sharp edges of the grass. "Aren't you afraid of the radiation?" Dean couldn't help but ask as he caught up with her. Aisha smiled and raised her wrist. "This is a meteorite. It can disperse the radiation around the body. So don't worry about it. Besides, we're just playing in this shallow radiation zone. We're not going to the barren areas outside. Even if there are no meteorites, my body won't be affected by this little bit of radiation." Dean couldn't help but look at the meteorite on her wrist. It was a crystal-clear stone, but it was different from a crystal and also different from a diamond. There seemed to be white light flowing inside. If he looked closely, it was like countless swimming white filaments, very spiritual, more like a hair-sized worm. "Is the meteorite only sold in the inner wall?" Dean was curious. "Where is the wasteland you are talking about? Are we still in the shallow radiation zone?" In his opinion, the radiation here was dense and scary. Even if it was the radiation zone of the barbarians inside the giant wall, it would have a certain impact on him. He couldn't live here for a long time, or else his body would be deformed by the radiation and the value of the body would rise sharply. But from Aisha's mouth, this was still a shallow radiation zone. Wouldn't lead armor be unable to withstand the radiation in the depths? "This meteorite is not for sale." Aisha smiled. "Only forces like our dragon family can get it. You can't buy it in the outside market even if you have more money. As for the wasteland, it will take at least half a day to reach there. Moreover, we can't be delayed by other monsters along the way." Dean's heart moved. "So, the monsters in the wasteland should be stronger than here, right?" "Of course," Aisha replied without hesitation. "But it's not stronger. It's a lot stronger. Even I don't want to go there. It's too dangerous." Dean's eyes flashed. Aisha didn't dare to go there even with her strength. Most of the monsters there were unimaginably strong. "What are you thinking about?" Aisha smiled as she saw Dean's dignified expression. Dean looked at her. He was silent for a moment. "I'm thinking that there are so many monsters and they are so strong. It's a bit difficult to erase them from the earth." Aisha was stunned for a moment, then laughed and said, "A little difficult? It's impossible. Do you want to eliminate all the monsters? I don't even dare to think about this, it's too difficult. You don't know how terrible these monsters are. Even if it's me, if I encounter some of the legendary monsters, I will be easily eaten. Even our giant wall of Sylvia can't resist the power of those monsters." Chapter 486. 300 years ago? Dean's mouth slightly moved as he heard her words. He slowly said, "In fact, there is no difference between 300 years ago and now." "No difference?" Aisha was surprised. She noticed that Dean didn't use a guessing tone but a statement as if he had seen it with his own eyes. She couldn't help but feel a trace of interest in his heart. "How do you know?" Dean looked at the grass ruins in front of him. He could vaguely see the asphalt road and the debris of collapsed high-rise buildings. He was silent and didn't answer Aisha's words because he didn't want to lie. Aisha saw that he couldn't say anything, so she was considerate and didn't continue to ask so as not to embarrass him. She had met a lot of pursuers since childhood and experienced all kinds of strange ways of pursuing. Obviously, Dean was the kind that pretended to be profound to arouse her interest. She didn't feel disgusted. Instead, there was a trace of pride in her heart. Dean would use such a way to show that he was interested in her. It also showed that she didn't dress up in vain today. "Would you like to join our dragon family?" She changed the topic and went straight to the topic. Since she felt that Dean was interested in her, she was too lazy to continue to talk about other useless topics. After all, her time was very precious. When she asked, she turned her head and looked at Dean softly. There was a trace of softness and hope in her eyes. Any man couldn't resist her, especially since she had a stunning face. Dean was startled for a moment. He didn't expect that she would suddenly make this invitation. Looking at her expectant look, there was a trace of interest in his heart. But in his mind, the tragic death of Jura and her husband appeared. The trace of enthusiasm in his heart suddenly cooled down. He moved his eyes away and whispered, "Sorry, I don't want to join other forces for the time being." Aisha was stunned. She didn't expect that Dean would refuse her so cruelly. Soon, she thought of the tricks of those pursuers. She pouted and thought that Dean was cunning, but it was not good to continue to pester him, so as not to lose her identity and easily arouse Dean's disgust. So she clapped her hands and said, "Let's go to the front." Dadian nodded. Aisha jumped on the boulders in front of her to avoid her skirt from being cut by the long grass. Dean saw her jump towards the red heat lurking in the grass. He was startled for a moment and was about to warn her. But suddenly his heart moved. He thought that it was strange. With Aisha's physique, how could she not detect the hidden monster? Or could it be that her perception was extremely poor? Thinking of this, he didn't say anything and followed them. If he warned them, it would expose his perceptive ability. Even though they had helped each other when they were young, after so many years, he still kept a trace of vigilance in his heart. But when he thought of his father, mother, and sister's tearful appearance, he faintly felt pain in his heart. He took a deep breath and said, "Yes." There was a trace of tenderness in Aisha's eyes. "They are so hateful. Do you hate them?" Dean shook his head slightly. "Why?" Aisha was puzzled. Dean slowly said, "How can I hate them if the way to let me live is to abandon me?" Aisha was startled and curiously asked, "How do you know it is to let you live?" Dean shook his head slightly and didn't want to say more. Aisha deeply looked at him and turned to look at the distance. "In fact, you are the same as me. No one wants you. You are abandoned, but you can't hate each other." Dadian turned to look at her. "You are also an orphan?" Aisha shook her head. "I am the second princess of the dragon clan. My father is still alive, but my mother has passed away." There was a trace of gloominess in her eyes, but she quickly restrained herself. Dean caught it. His intuition told him that there was more to it than meets the eye. But he knew that he shouldn't ask too much, so he said, "Since your father is still alive, you are not an orphan, and no one wants you." "You don't understand." Aisha shook her head. "You know that I am the second princess. There is a sister above me. She is the eldest princess of the dragon clan, and also the successor of my father. She awakened her bloodline power when she was born and became the saint of the dragon clan. She is known as a rare genius of the dragon clan. She enjoys the love of tens of thousands of people. I will always be a foil standing next to her. I will always be an inconspicuous existence." Dadian was curious about the bloodline power she was talking about, but he didn't dare to ask as he saw her sad face. He comforted her. "Your sister has become a saint of the dragon clan, so she must bear a lot of responsibilities. There is a saying that the greater the ability, the greater the responsibility. There are two explanations for this sentence. The first one is that the greater the ability, the more responsibility the person should bear. The second is that the more responsibilities a person bears, the more power they will obtain. Although the meaning seems to be the same, if the order is different, sometimes it will be two different situations. This sister of yours has awakened the power of her bloodline. With this power, she obtained the identity of the dragon clan's holy maiden. From this, it can be inferred that this identity will not only bring her love, but also hardship." Aisha bit her lower lip and looked at him bitterly. "Why are you speaking up for her?" Dean scratched his head. "I didn't speak up for her. I just want to say that we don't envy her. Since she got it, then let her have it." Aisha pursed her lips. Although she knew that Dean was trying to comfort her, she was still unhappy. "If that's the case, then it's fine. But you don't understand my sister. She has been spoiled since childhood. Although he did not understand why his reaction made her smile, he was relieved to see that she was not angry. Time passed bit by bit in silence. Dean slowly turned his head and changed the topic. "What's your sister's name?" "Her name is Hathaway," Aisha whispered. Dean secretly remembered the name. He thought that he would pay attention to her if he met her in the future. Perhaps he would overturn the inner wall in the near future. Then he would give her a taste of bitterness. It could be regarded as a repayment for Aisha's kindness. "Would you like to go to the inner wall with me?" Aisha looked at Dean. Dean looked at her lonely and delicate eyes. His heart was throbbing. It was difficult for him to refuse. But this reaction was soon replaced by reason. He clenched his fingers. "I'm sorry, but I really won't go to the inner wall for the time being." "Why?" There was a trace of anger in Aisha's eyes. "Don't people from the outer wall like to go to the inner wall?" Dean smiled. "I don't want to go for the time being, but I'll go in person in the future." Aisha bit her lower lip as she stared at him. "My sister always targets me. I have no friends since I was a child. All the things I like will be destroyed by her. All my friends will be expelled by her. Even my pet was killed by her. Can't you come to the inner wall to accompany me? You can rest assured that I will protect you. I have the power to protect my friends now." Dean's heart was tangled as he looked at her repeated invitations. His invention had been developed. If he migrated to the inner wall, then he wouldn't have such a safe environment. Moreover, according to Aisha, the internal situation of the Dragon Clan was a bit complicated. He didn't want to get involved in it. Once the new invention was finished, he would have the power to protect himself. He would even be able to overthrow the inner wall, then he would be able to go wherever he wanted. "I'm sorry, but I really don't want to go for the time being. How about you give me another year?" "Oh no, half a year. I promise that I will personally go to the inner wall to see you after half a year." Dean declined. Aisha looked at him. "Why do you have to wait for half a year?" Dean wryly smiled. "I have my own reasons." Aisha saw that he was in a dilemma. She didn't want to force him. "Well, I'll wait for you." Dean was relieved, but there was still some embarrassment and apology in his heart. After all, they had repeatedly invited him, but he had mercilessly refused. He felt ashamed. Chapter 487. "I don't want to talk about my unhappy things." Aisha put away the disappointment in her eyes. She turned to look at Dean. "How are you doing in the outer wall? Is there anything I can help you with? Although my connections aren't strong, but it's easy for me to interfere in the affairs of the outer wall." Dean was ashamed. He had come to ask her for help, but he had repeatedly refused her. It was a bit difficult for him to ask for help. However, considering his plans for the future, he hesitated for a moment before forcing himself to say, "There is indeed something that I want to discuss with you." "What's the matter?" Aisha's eyes lit up. "I'll help you as long as I can." Dean quickly organized the words in his mind. "Is the Dragon Clan strong in the inner wall? How is it compared to the monastery?" "That's it?" Aisha smiled. "Of course our Dragon Clan is very strong. We are the strongest among the 3 major devil families. The monastery can't compare with us in terms of fighting strength. But I can easily sweep a branch of the monastery by myself. If my sister goes, she can even challenge all the masters of the monastery by herself." Dean was startled. "Your sister is that strong?" "Of course." Aisha smiled. "My sister is a bad person and has a bad temper, but her strength is first class. There are no more than 5 people in the inner wall who can match my sister." "Top 5 of the inner wall?" Dean was surprised as he didn't expect her sister to be so powerful. It can be said that she was standing at the top of the giant wall. He couldn't help but ask, "Is your sister atop Limitless? How many monsters can she hunt?" He stared at Aisha as he asked this question. This question was very important as it meant that he would be able to understand the top combat power of the inner wall. It was the most important point of his future plan. After all, he had to know himself and the enemy to win. Limitless? Aisha smiled. But she thought that Dean was a person of the outer wall, so the information he got was limited. She was already tired of hearing things, but it was difficult for others to find out the top secret. She immediately explained in detail. My sister and I are pioneers. That is, the existence above the limitless. You hunters are divided into 3 stages: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. But the limiters only have 2 stages: beginner and advanced. Ordinary limiters with rare magic marks can single-handedly kill monsters around level 50. If they have learned some advanced fighting techniques, then even if they encounter monsters above level 60, they can still barely deal with them. Above the limitless are the pioneers. Aisha's voice was soft as she explained to Dean in detail. The origin of the name pioneers is mainly because of the existence of the wasteland. Only those who have reached the combat power of the pioneers can set foot in the wasteland. Otherwise, it is easy to die in there. Although they still maintain the human brain and emotions, but if they continue to evolve and evolve to the extreme, the part of beastification will become more and more. Dean couldn't help but ponder. When the hand is no longer a human's hand, but a beast's claw. When the body is no longer a human's body, but a humanoid monster, will the original human face be lost in the end? If the body is beastified, will the brain also change? If the brain changes, then human emotions, will they all disappear? He was lost in thought as he thought of these. Getting magic marks could make one stronger, but at the same time, it seemed that one would rarely notice what they had lost. What's wrong with you? Aisha looked at Dean in surprise. Did she say too much and hit him? Dean came back to his senses and suddenly felt a little depressed. He shook his head slightly. It's nothing. I'm just surprised that we humans can be so strong. Speaking of this, the corner of his mouth slightly twitched. Aisha thought, sure enough, but she felt a little strange. From Dean's words, she seemed to hear a little self-deprecating flavor. What is the worm powder you mentioned before? Dean had recovered from his thoughts and continued to ask. As for the evolution, he suppressed it in the bottom of his heart. He didn't want to think about it anymore because he knew that it was futile to think about it. In such a world, if there was no magic mark to bring power, he would die at any time. It seemed that there was no room for choice if he didn't want to survive but just to live. Aisha smiled and said, Are you thinking that the worm powder is the powder of the worm powder? When I heard it for the first time, I also thought so. Later I learned that it was not the case at all. Guess what it is? Dean saw that she was in high spirits and thought for a moment. It can't be feces, right? How do you know? Aisha looked at him in surprise. Dean was dumbfounded. It's a unique name. Aisha giggled. Indeed. What is the worm powder? Dean continued to ask. Aisha smiled. It's a kind of insect. Many terrible monsters hate its feces. That's why it's called the worm powder. So that's how it is. Dean understood that most of the insects were in the hands of the big forces in the inner wall. He brought the topic back. You said that your sister can fight all the masters of the monastery. So the monastery should be afraid of your dragon clan? Aisha shook her head. On the contrary, our dragon clan is not willing to provoke the monastery. Although the masters of the monastery aren't strong, but they have deep heritage. They belong to independent forces and don't belong to the management of His Majesty. Our family and the monastery don't invade each other. But if they take the initiative to provoke us, then we won't be easy to deal with. Dean couldn't help but ask. They don't have many masters. Why don't they belong to the management of His Majesty? Aisha shook her head. It's a long story. Let's talk about it later. You're not a member of the Dragon Clan, so I can't tell you some things. I hope you can forgive me. After all, some things involve very private things. Even I didn't know about them until I became a pioneer. There was a trace of apology on her face. Dean came to his senses. It's nothing. I asked too much. At the same time, he couldn't help but be shocked. The monastery seemed to be deeper than he had imagined. It's good that you're not angry. Aisha glanced at him secretly. She was relieved to see that he wasn't angry. Why would I be angry with you? You have your own difficulties. I asked too much. Dean smiled and continued to ask. You said before that there are 3 major families. Apart from your dragon clan, what are the other 2 families? Apart from our dragon clan, the other 2 are the Wing clan and the Rock clan. Aisha saw him smile and her pretty face bloomed into a smile. Our 3 major families are ordered by His Majesty to defend the giant wall. The Wing clan is in charge of the security of the sky. The Dragon clan is in charge of the security of the land. The Rock clan is in charge of the dangers lurking underground. For example, some powerful monsters will drill into the giant wall. If they cause chaos and casualties, the Rock clan will be held responsible. I see. Dean suddenly understood. No wonder there were a lot of monsters that could drill into the giant wall. Most of them were killed by the Rock clan as soon as they drilled into the giant wall. What do you mean by awakening the bloodline power? Is it convenient to say it? Dean continued to ask. Aisha was a bit embarrassed. I can only briefly say that the bloodline power is a unique power of our Devil clan. Like our Dragon clan, every person born with the orthodox bloodline has this power in their body. Only some can awaken it while others are dormant for life. However, only a few can awaken it. There may not be 1 in 1,000 people who can awaken it. The probability is so low? Dean was surprised. No wonder her sister could become a saint after awakening the bloodline power. Aisha nodded. So once the bloodline power is awakened, it will be very terrible. Her face was a bit sad. Dean saw that he touched her sore spot, so he didn't ask anymore. He changed the topic. Is there anyone stronger than the pioneers? Hearing this, Aisha was slightly stunned. She thought for a moment and said, There should be, but I have never seen it. Maybe it only exists in legends. You haven't seen them either? Dean looked at her. Aisha nodded. My sister is the strongest I've ever seen, but she's just a pioneer. Dean was relieved. It seemed that there was hope for his new invention to deal with the inner wall. Aisha suddenly thought of something and said to Dean, Are you still a hunter? Dean nodded. Chapter 488. Dudian said, Thank you. Aisha looked at him. Shall we meet again next week? Next week? Dean pondered for a moment. All right. Aisha smiled as she looked into the distance. Her legs gently shook as if she was swinging. Are we friends? Dudian was startled as he looked at her face. After a moment of silence, he whispered, If you want, we can be friends. Of course I'm willing. Aisha grinned. Dean didn't speak. The air was quiet. Dean realized that the quiet atmosphere was a bit awkward. He wanted to find a topic to ease the tension, but suddenly found that he couldn't say anything to her. He had a lot of words to say, but these words were too shocking for the world, so he couldn't talk to anyone. Aisha slowly stood up after a few minutes of silence. It's getting late. I'll go back first. I'll bring you the god's marrow the next time we meet. Dean also got up. I'll send you off. Well, I'll send you to the corner. Aisha whispered. Dudian nodded. Both of them jumped down from the tall building. Unlike Aisha, who landed lightly, Dean stepped on the concrete tiles outside the building and ran down. When he landed, he rolled a few times to unload the force and then jumped to the ground. He wouldn't be injured if he jumped down from the tall building with his physique. The concrete floor had turned into mud after more than 300 years. The softness wouldn't hurt his feet, but it would expose his abnormal physique. With Aisha's knowledge, it was easy for her to speculate that his magic mark was extraordinary. This legendary deified magic mark was also one of his trump cards. Although Aisha was very close to him, and she was the first person he met when he woke up, he still didn't dare to relax. Aisha waited for Dean to stand firm. Let's walk back slowly. All right. Dean nodded. Both of them walked side by side in silence as they walked through the ruins. Cars and bus stop signs covered in moss could be seen on the roadside. There were skeletons of dead monsters on the ground, but most of them were human skeletons. The eyes on the skeletons, which had long been gnawed by venomous snakes or insects, silently stared at the creatures that passed by. The once bustling city was now the capital of the undead. Roar! A roar echoed from the rubble as they passed by a ruined building. Dean had long noticed that this was an ordinary walking dead in the appearance of a young woman. Her body was stuck in the stone, and half of her face was missing. It seemed that something had bitten it off. She roared at them with her claws, but she could not move. Whoosh! Aisha kicked lightly and a stone flew out from the ground. It accurately hit the undead's head like a bullet. The undead's brain burst and died on the spot. Dean saw the splattered brains. He asked Aisha, "Do you know what cold crystal is used for?" Cold crystal? Aisha was surprised as she saw the dead undead. "I'm not sure, but the Monster Research Institute has been collecting it. It is said that it seems to be related to the disaster 300 years ago." Cold crystal is related to the disaster? Dean's eyes narrowed. Aisha nodded and said, "According to the records, the world 300 years ago wasn't like this. It was caused by a disaster. These undeads used to be human beings 300 years ago, but they had lost their reason and thinking. They were no longer human beings. I heard that the Monster Research Institute had secretly captured different types of undeads for research in an attempt to restore their human memories and find the root cause of the disaster 300 years ago. But there seems to be no progress." Dean's eyes flashed slightly. He knew a little bit about the root cause of the disaster, but not completely. After all, the things he knew didn't include the strange virus. It happened after he was locked in the freezer. Could it be that the virus was also a biochemical weapon created later? Roar! The two of them walked to a corner, and a mantis-like monster suddenly jumped out from the nearby bushes. It was 3 meters tall, and its entire body was dark green, the same color as the deep grass. It hid in the bushes and was difficult to detect. Aisha's reaction was extremely fast. The moment the monster appeared, she suddenly rushed out. She turned a few times in the air, and suddenly dropped her foot. Her high heels were like a sharp sword. She hit the monster's head and trampled on the ground. The soft ground sunk and a small pit was formed. Aisha raised her foot and shook the blood on her high heel. She continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. Dean noticed that her boots were not simple shoes but metal. No wonder they could withstand her sudden burst of speed. After killing a few monsters, Dean and Aisha returned to the corner of the giant wall. "Do you want me to send you back?" Aisha looked around. "There are a lot of monsters nearby. I'm a bit worried if you go alone." Dean felt warm in his heart. He shook his head. "I can handle it. My ability to survive is still very strong." Aisha looked at him and sighed. "Well, I'll see you next week." "Okay." Dean nodded. Aisha waved to Dean, turned around, and quickly disappeared behind the deep grass ruins. Dean watched her go away. He turned and walked along the other side of the giant wall. After walking for a long time, he came to a deep grass. He looked around but didn't see any monsters. He didn't see Aisha either. His heart was relieved. He spread his wings and flew straight to the giant wall. When he was on the giant wall, he immediately retracted his wings and quickly ran. A few hours later, Dean returned to the headquarters of the 9th District in the Commercial District. As soon as he arrived at the headquarters, Dean called Hawkeye. "Prepare some parasitic soul worms. It's best if they are rare or rare level." Hawkeye was stunned when he heard Dean's words. "Rare and rare level parasitic soul worm? Do you need some? Can you get them?" Dean asked directly. Hawkeye returned to his senses and smiled bitterly. "I can, but parasitic soul worms are very difficult to raise, so it's very difficult to find existing ones. Moreover, it's rare and rare. This kind of parasitic soul worm often appears on the market and is bought. Try to collect as much as you can, Dean said. Hawkeye was embarrassed. Elder, the last time the 8th District attacked the 13th branch of our 9th District, we spent a lot of money to rob the 13th branch. At present, we don't have much money left in the inventory except for the normal operating expenses. Dean's eyebrows twitched as he thought for a moment. We have several 5-star alchemists and great potion masters. We can ask them to make something to sell or directly exchange it. Hawkeye cautiously said, Elder, it usually takes a long time for them to make things. It's a bit difficult if you are in urgent need. Dean frowned as this was a problem. He thought of a person. This matter will be handed over to Amy, who was previously imprisoned. Tell her that she can make things as collateral for the time she was imprisoned. Let her do as she sees fit. Yes. Hawkeye respectfully replied. Dean went straight to the alchemy room after Hawkeye left. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dean came out of the alchemy room and once again left the 9th District alone. He sneaked out of the Golden Wall and came to the agreed place with Yvette. At the moment the sky was dark and there were no stars. He noticed 4 red figures. One of them was Yvette. The other 3 were in another place. They didn't emit any smell. Dean understood that Yvette was worried that he would kidnap her again. So she sent someone to be her bodyguard. Whoosh! In the darkness, he quietly appeared behind Yvette. Yvette heard the movement and turned around. She was relieved to see Dean, but there was a trace of tension in her eyes. I've been waiting for a long time. Dean lowered his voice. What do you think? Yvette whispered, I agree. Dean nodded. From today on you just need to stay dormant and wait for the opportunity. I'll inform you if there's a situation. In addition, I came here today to bring you news from inside the military. In 5 days they will officially attack the Red Maple Mountains. Yvette was taken aback. They're going to attack in 5 days? Dudian whispered. This time they are determined to win. You have to retreat. They have the legendary invention, steam gun, in their hands. You will lose this time. If you stick to your defense, then you will suffer a crushing defeat. Yvette's face was a bit ugly. Dean saw her expression and guessed what she was thinking. I know that you barbarians had a hard time attacking the fortress. No one is willing to leave. Even your father, your brothers and sisters are not willing to leave. Therefore, this is an opportunity. They are unwilling, but you have to tell your father that we must retreat. Yvette blankly looked at him. Dean saw that her political mind was a bit slow, so he carefully said, Your smart brothers will want to make a contribution in front of your father. Most of them will suggest to fight. Therefore, you must be persuaded to leave now. Although you barbarians will fight to the end with the military and pay a heavy price, after this battle, your position will rise. Your military talent will be valued by your father. This is the first step to your position. There was a trace of palpitation in Yvette's eyes. She couldn't help but look at the boy who was 2 years younger than her. She used to hear people say that the brains of the people inside the wall were smarter than the barbarians, but now it seemed that it wasn't an exaggeration. Dudian continued, You have to try your best to persuade them before the start of the battlefield. But you can't expose the reason why you will lose. You have to analyze it from a military point of view. I have written it down for you. Go back and memorize it. He handed her a note that he had prepared in advance. Yvette took it in a daze and looked at it. The handwriting was very beautiful and it was densely packed. Remember, you have to show your existence. Dean stared at her. Expelling barbarians is the first step of the military. Your actions have angered the military, and they got my legendary weapon. Not only will they expel you from the fortress, but they want to catch all of you in one fell swoop. Yvette was frightened. She was convinced by Dean's words. What should we do? She subconsciously asked. So what should we do? The escape route and method are all written here, Dean said. You only need to follow the instructions and lead your father and your people to escape from the military's encirclement. But the rest of your people will suffer losses. You don't have to worry too much about it." Yvette was speechless as she looked at him. "It depends on your performance whether you can lead your people to live or not." Dean deeply looked at her. "If there is nothing else, I will go back first." Yvette clenched the note as she stared into Dean's eyes. "Can I really believe you?" Dean looked at her and whispered, "Believe me, live." Yvette was startled. "You have to know that the purpose of me making you a king is to help me to occupy the outer wall in the future. I will use the outer wall as a springboard to declare war on the inner wall. So I won't let you suffer too much losses," Dean said. Yvette was silent. She couldn't refute this point. "It's getting late. Let's go back." Dean turned. "Next time you don't need to bring anyone to follow you. I won't harm you. If I want to harm you, no one can protect you." With that, he leaped into the air and disappeared into the darkness of the night. There was a trace of horror in Yvette's eyes as she heard Dean's words. Chapter 489. It was a weapon that looked like a giant black shield. It was about 4 meters long, completely black, and looked slightly heavy. Noyce held the shield with both hands. He was puzzled as he saw Dean's satisfied expression. "Elder, the materials you brought back should be enough to cast several weapons. Why did you choose to cast such a shield?" "This isn't a shield." Dean smiled and softly corrected his words. He reached out and grabbed the chromolybdenum handle on the edge of the black shield. He whispered, "Get out of the way." Noyce felt that the heavy shield was lifted by Dudian with one hand. He was shocked and quickly retreated. "Retreat again," Dudian continued. Noyce was startled and immediately retreated to the wall behind him. Dean's eyes fell on the black shield. He clenched his fingers and threw it forward. Clang! 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 The sound of metal colliding echoed. A huge shadow swept by and set off a hurricane. The flowers in the vase that was used to decorate the office were blown away. The cold light was aimed at the tip of Noyce's nose. It was the sharp tip of a black sword. Noyce's pupils shrank as his hair stood up. The black shield in Dean's hand turned into a black blade that was more than 10 meters long. It covered almost half of the office. The appearance of this black blade was ferocious and terrifying. It had 3 joints, and there were natural barbs and hooks on the inside and outside of the joint. On the surface, it still had the appearance of Splitter's blade. The only difference was that its joints were embedded with telescopic steel pipes made of chromolybdenum metal. This allowed the blade to repeatedly shrink and shrink, just like a 3-section stick. The 3 sections could be folded into a length. Dean was very satisfied. The style was exactly the same as his idea. The master craftsman hired by Hawkeye had 2 brushes. Noyce came back to his senses. He swallowed his saliva and said, "Your Excellency, isn't this weapon too long?" He couldn't imagine how to fight with a weapon that was more than 10 meters long. "It's just right." Dean indifferently smiled. There were 2 ways to fight with this weapon. The first was to fight on land. He could shrink into the shape of the previous black giant shield. This was used for close combat. Although it looked like a black giant shield, the outer edge of the black giant shield was a sharp edge, plus the handle was at the edge after shrinking. It could be used as a 4-meter-long broadsword. If he encountered an enemy that he needed to fight with all his strength, or in a group battle, he could restore his weapon to the form of Splitter. Borrowing the power of his wings to fly in the air, he could easily wield this weapon. After all, wings were one of the magic marks of the Splitter. If the weapon was too short, it would be hard to avoid close combat with the enemy, and it would be easy to be counterattacked. In this way, the use of wings would be meaningless. However, with the sharp blade of the Splitter, it was different. He could attack the enemy, but the enemy couldn't hurt him. Noyce was dumbfounded as he heard Dudien's words. "Elder, didn't you provide 2 materials? Why is there only 1 weapon?" "It's 2. Dean smiled. His other hand held the other handle with a hole in it. This handle looked like a decorative hole, but after he held it, the more than 10 meters long blade suddenly split apart. The back of the blade was like a shadow materializing, and a similar black blade appeared. Seeing this, Noyce was tongue-tied and somewhat stunned. The weapon was like a pair of scissors. It could be combined into one or split into two. Dean held one in each hand and gently weighed it. He felt that it was quite suitable. He immediately closed it, pressed the handle, and swung it. The black blade immediately retracted and returned to the previous black shield shape. The edge of the shield was extremely sharp, flashing a cold light. "Tell them to make a strong chain to tie this thing," Dean said to Noyce. Noyce was surprised. "Don't you need to make a scabbard?" Dean shook his head. "A knife that kills doesn't need a scabbard." Noyce understood and left. Time passed by in a hurry. Dean immersed himself in the alchemy room every day. He only came out once for breakfast. The reason was that he could read the morning paper and know about the recent developments within the giant wall. As for lunch and dinner, he let Noyce send them to the alchemy room. He would come out and eat. His need for high-calorie food wasn't so urgent because of the warmth brought by the wine. It also prevented him from collecting a large number of expensive food ingredients. Although he didn't plunder a lot of things when he was still a master of invention, but he did release some information. Moreover, the circle of the outer wall wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. It was easy for people to find flaws in his identity. "It's all about the war. It seems that no one remembers me anymore." Dean's expression was indifferent as he looked at the reports in the newspapers. Although he didn't care about the vanity, but he could see the means of controlling the situation. The military didn't show even half a bit of gratitude for the steam rifle that he had donated for free. Perhaps, in the eyes of the military, it was a good thing for the Holy Church to lose a master of divinity. Knock. There was a knock on the door. Dean knew that it was Hawkeye. "Come in." Hawkeye pushed the door and looked at Dean. "Elder, the elders invited you to attend the meeting to discuss the war between the barbarians and the military." "Elders' meeting?" Dean raised his eyebrows. "I'm not free. I'm not going." Hawkeye was startled. "Elder, you have to attend the elders' meeting. All the elders must attend the meeting. Even the Night King and Pluto can't be absent." Chapter 490. Elder, I'm afraid it's not appropriate," Hawkeye said. "It's settled. Go." Dean didn't want to say more. Attending the elders' meeting was just a waste of time. It was better to stay in the alchemy room and do something instead of sitting there and scheming with the Night King. Hawkeye looked at him. He wanted to say something but hesitated. He sighed and left the office. Dean took a stack of paper and ink and went back to his alchemy room after Hawkeye left. The next day, Dean called Noyce early in the morning to send the military report. Sure enough, the barbarians were defeated and suffered heavy casualties, even though they had the geographical advantage due to the cooperation of steam rifles and artillery. Although the military had suffered countless casualties in the last battle, but the existence of the steam rifle allowed the reserve army to wield strength comparable to that of an intermediate hunter. Only a senior hunter could dodge the bullets of an ordinary soldier with a steam rifle. Of course, this didn't mean that a senior hunter's speed could be faster than a bullet propelled by steam power. But a senior hunter could react before an ordinary soldier could shoot. Although the operation of the steam gun was simple and didn't require too much physical strength, but an ordinary person needed time to aim at the enemy and pull the valve to shoot. But this time was enough for a senior hunter to react. The barbarians really don't want to retreat. Yvette, it's up to you. Dean's eyes flashed. After breakfast, he went back to his alchemy room and got busy. He called Hawkeye to transport the materials if he lacked them. Although the power of the Dark Church wasn't big in the 9th region, but the network was very wide. Even some rare metals could be easily obtained. There were dark believers in the 9th region in all walks of life. Another day passed. It was the appointed time to meet Aisha. Dean left the commercial district alone. He didn't bring the splitter with him. He ran along the giant wall and came to the western corner of the giant wall. It was still early. Dean saw that he had nothing to do after he came down from the giant wall. He went to the nearby monster nests to practice his fighting ability. The monsters in the western corner were all around level 30, but most of them were ordinary monsters. Their combat power was much weaker than the named monsters of the same level. During the hunt, he felt that his combat ability was still very weak. He could only rely on his superior strength and speed to kill the monsters. After hunting 7 or 8 monsters in a row, Dean gradually figured out some trick. His fighting skills became more agile. There were some highly toxic monsters among these monsters. Even he didn't dare to touch the venom on their bodies. Even a limitless expert wouldn't dare to touch it easily. After all, the body's strength was one thing, and the resistance to the venom was another. There were weeds and ruins. He was speechless. "Let's go for a walk around here?" Haisha nodded and said, "Okay." Dean held the god's marrow and took her to wander around. Occasionally, monsters would appear and Haisha would take the initiative to kill them. This reminded Dean of her previous words, "You will protect me." He wryly smiled in his heart. Now it seemed that the situation was reversed. They chatted as they walked. Aisha told Dean about some interesting things in the inner wall. Time passed unknowingly. At noon, Aisha looked at the sun and said to Dean, "It's getting late. I have to go back." "All right." Dean didn't ask her to stay. He was in a hurry to go back to take the god's marrow. He was busy with his new invention. Both of them went back to the west corner of the giant wall. Aisha waved to Dean and walked away. Her figure disappeared from the corner. Dean went to the corner and watched her figure go away. Aisha felt the movement and looked back. Her face bloomed into a smile. "You should go back too." "Well." Dean smiled and nodded. Aisha waved again. She went straight along the giant wall until her figure disappeared from Dean's sight. He could only see a red dot through thermal vision. Dean turned around and walked along the giant wall. He was about to take off his coat and fly over the giant wall after walking for more than 10 minutes when he was startled. He saw that Aisha, who had left earlier, had appeared behind the giant wall above his head. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.